Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a guest episode and I have Dr. Peter Tierney on the podcast. He is a sports scientist and performance coach. He's worked in elite team sports, specifically rugby, and as well as endurance settings, does some consulting and still does some one-on-one coaching as well too. And so I was super excited to talk to Peter and especially things around wearable technology and things like resting heart rate and stuff. So we talked about how there's this over-reliance on wearables and how that can sometimes lead to issues there. How do you decipher what is important information, what's important to actually look at? We also discuss recovery, stress load. We talked about what tells you if somebody's stress load is high and what things we need to do, why it's important to look at individual baselines for this. Also, we looked at things like the most important recovery things that somebody can do to help speed up the recovery process. And he has a very interesting method for doing that. Also, we talked about circadian rhythms. We talked about caffeine trade. We also talked about resting heart rates, why it's a super helpful metric. And we also discussed things like alcohol and how that can impact resting heart rates and HRV and things that you need to do. If you want to learn more about recovery and learn more about the wearables and what these can tell you and some of their limitations, then this is the episode for you. Enjoy. Again, I really enjoyed talking to Peter about this. I thought it was super interesting and we could have gone way longer, but we both have things we needed to do there. Enjoy this episode. First, though, before you dive in, if you find this podcast to be helpful in any way, if you could leave a rating and review, that'll help more people find it. And then if you also give me a follow on Jeff HOEA, that's where I'm most active. If you have any questions on this episode, you can reach out to me there. And so make sure you give me a follow there. So enjoy this episode with Dr. Peter Tierney. Peter, thanks for coming on, man. Super excited to chat with you today. Like I was saying off air, I think this will be, for me, it will be awesome to pick your brain on some things, but also will be super valuable for the audience as well too. But anytime I bring somebody new on, I always just like to just go over your background and how you got to where you're at today. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, cheers, Jeff, for inviting me as well. I'm a sports scientist and performance coach by trade. I always say that very specifically because all of the positions that I've held are what I call hybrid. And what I mean by that is mixes of what you probably traditionally call a strength and conditioning coach who would deliver a coach program, but also maybe traditionally a sports scientist who people tend to think has more research, data, analysis, that types of things, where all of the roles I've held have actually had split components across both of those. And I've loved that. I've always wanted that. I've sought that out intentionally as well. That's my experience. A lot of the last 14, 15 years has been at elite and professional level sports. So I've worked a lot in team sports, so rugby and I'll say soccer for the listeners, but football mostly in the UK. And then I've worked with a number of endurance athletes, weightlifters, swimmers, quite a good mix. And again, that has been intentional. I wanted to work across all the different sports that I could possibly experience because to me, that just gives me breadth and perspective that I get from working with different people, different environments. I also spent a few years working in innovation, senior researcher. So that was a little bit of a different experience in a company, but still a lot of transfer and similarities in terms of skill sets and tools that I would have used within a sporting organization and within an innovation organization as well.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's super cool, man. I think you said you're, like you said, performance coach, but then also sports scientist. So like when you work with these teams, what are maybe some examples of some things that you like work on with them specifically?
Yeah, so it will depend on the environment and the team. But for example, if when I worked in rugby, a lot of the work I would have done would have been around supporting programming, coaching within the gym, delivering speed, change direction, agility work, fitness work on field, but then also helping to process some of the data around that as well. So common technologies that we've used in team sports, heart rate sensors that are very common now across, I would say, every activity, not even just every sport. GPS technology or microsensor technology. So that would have been the technology that's worn between the shoulder blades. So again, becoming more common now, I would say more common across sports, but also I say within sports. So that technology now is not only reserved for the top senior teams, it's now used in men's and women's teams. It's now used in senior and underage teams as well. So I would have helped a lot with analyzing, processing, but also educating on a lot of that data and what it actually means. And so, like I said at the start, around those hybrid type of positions that I've held, I've always used data and technology within my role, but never on its own. It's always been thinking about coaching, behavior change. And I was fortunate when I started my career, I was sandwiched quite literally between two of the senior coaches that I worked with, sporting coaches. So they were rugby coaches. And every day they reminded me or challenged me when I was doing my PhD or when I was coaching or analyzing data. What does this mean? How make this make sense to me? And I think that's paid off for me personally from a selfish point of view, because now the immediate thing I have is always thinking about both elements. Okay, from a data perspective, is this accurate, reliable? Is it evidence-based? But also, okay, how am I going to apply this into real world situations with real people in with real problems as well?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Bridging the gap between the two, which like you said is super important because there is all this data now and it's like, all right, so what do you do with it? And also what does it mean? And I know I'm sure a lot of people misinterpret the data on it too. And that can become just as problematic. Or even, I'm sure you've seen this too, just an over-reliance maybe on the data as well too, and not as much on like subjective feelings and stuff like that.
Definitely. Huge over-reliance. And I think in my experience, there's always been people who sit on two extremes. So if you think on one end, there's this sort of over-reliance on data, almost obsession with it. And even in the health population now, there's a term called orthosomnia, which is this fear or anxiety related to the perfect sleep. And so I think there's a camp on this end. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I think there's maybe people don't are reluctant to even look at any data. And they will say, no, go off feel, go off experience. And to me, I've never understood why you have to sit on either end. To me, I've always tried to, I currently do, and I always propose to people that they are somewhere in this balance. Of course, there'll be some situations where maybe you don't have time to analyze data, so you have to lean towards your experience and your anecdote and opinion. But then there's other times where you have more time to lean towards data. But to me, it's always using both. So if it's a decision around how many minutes of training does a player do today, or what loads do we prescribe in the gym, or how much running does somebody do, it's always based on both the information that we can collect, speaking to the person, the experience that I have, but also my peers and practitioners have as well. And all of those things turning together, spinning all the plates, you hopefully come up with the best decision for the person that you're working with.
And you hit on it too there at the end where it's like you, not that you hope, like you obviously use your intuition and like you said, all your experience, your knowledge, everything like that. But still at the same time, you still are, it's still not an exact science. Like again, there's things that we know that are generally going to work, but you still do need to probably do some trial and error on what may work better for one person and whatever there is, whatever their context is at that point in time as well too. All those things certainly matter.
100%. And I think I always say that I'm an evidence-based person, but that evidence is not just the scientific literature and the published papers. Of course, that's a huge component of it, but the experience I've had from working in sports, in innovation, even collecting data on, for example, technologies now that just come to market, or some I've gotten my hands on just before they've come to market. I know how much data is not published in scientific journals. That doesn't mean it's not valuable. And if you think about it from a team perspective, if you're a soccer team, a football team, basketball team, there might be some things that you don't want to publish that you feel are competitive advantages. Maybe that's something that you've gathered some insight after a couple of years of trying a few things where you go, this every single time this metric comes up just when we're about to win or just before an injury, whatever it might be. And that's potentially an advantage to you over your competitors. So I know that some of that information lives with every other team in the world. And also in an innovation perspective, the amount of research and testing we did that doesn't get shared because it is intellectual property of a company. And so when I say evidence, like I said, that published research, the anecdotal, or sorry, the sort of applied research that you would collect yourself, but also within that evidence is anecdote, experience, nuance, all those things. And sometimes the best coaches in the world are doing the things before the research is published. And so it is always a fine balance. There's no black and white. The lines are blurred between all of those different people.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point you bring up where some of this information I'm sure doesn't get out. Because I've asked a few other people to come on the podcast that are like, they're like a director of performance or they do some sort of like nutrition performance for certain teams. And now it makes me wonder if part of the reason they can't come on and do podcasts and they have these NDAs is to be like, hey, we don't want to give away some information that you're finding out that may lead to that competitive advantage. I'm totally speculating. I don't know if that's the case, but it makes me wonder there.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. And also I think sometimes it is just time. And sometimes when you're in those full-time roles, it's really challenging to get a little bit of space to have those conversations. And then it also maybe just depends on, it might not be seen as a conflict from within that sort of performance or sporting team, but maybe the front of house thinks, oh, I'm not sure. Or maybe it's the timing, playoff time, the time of season. Teams and athletes and coaches just sometimes tend to want to lock in and preserve energy for those times. So it could be a mix of any of those. It is tricky. I do feel, because I know a lot of people who want to share and who do share a lot when they have the opportunity and capacity to do it.
So are you at this point in time, are you still working with teams? Is it more like full-time role? Is it more on a consulting basis? Do you work one-on-one with athletes, stuff like that? Or what does that kind of look like for your day-to-day, but now at this point?
Yeah, so my day to day, I'm consulting full time, which is like a different answer to what you've asked. But a lot of my work spans quite a breadth at the moment. And again, that's intentional for the time being. So I do some individual work one to one. Those one to ones, I do some in person. It just geography is obviously a limiter in how many people I would see in person, but I do a mix of people online in terms of performance consulting. Some of those are business people, founders, CEOs, high level executives. Some are high level athletes that I referred to. Some are general population as well. So it's quite a mix. In terms of teams or organizations that I work with, again, it's a range from I've done some work and some projects and consulting with elite sport organizations, but I also do some work with fitness brands and sports tech companies as well. And so for me, because of my experiences and because of the interest that I have across those, it sounds quite broad. And it is compared to some other peers that I know, but there are so many parallels and similarities to the approaches or the research that I'm doing or the testing or the implementation. My current portfolio of people that I work with is a bit of a mix of all those different things.
Are you, and I understand if you can't speak on it, but are you able to speak on anything like specific, or even if it's like a broad, hey, here's some things that I'm specifically working on with X team that you don't have to necessarily say? Is there anything like that you can share? And totally understand if you can't, because I know, again, we come back to some of the stuff I get, you can't share all of it
Yeah.
and things like that.
I can give you a bit of an insight into a project that I've just finished up recently with an elite sporting organization. So I did a project with this organization to develop some internal resources around recovery and sleep, and I think a more nuanced approach to what we just spoke about before, an integration or a hybrid approach of using data and using feel or perception or coaching experience to make the best decisions around recovery. Now, in sport, and this is not reserved for one sport, but in sport in general, the intensity of competition is going up across team sports. So you can see that data in soccer, you can see it in rugby. I haven't looked at it in terms of basketball, but I can pretty much guarantee that's the same as well. So not only do you have an increase in intensity, you actually have an increase in density. And what I mean by that is the number of games. And so in the Premier League and in football and soccer in the UK, you typically have the top teams who would play two games every week almost, not for the whole season, but they might go from domestic competition on the weekend, and 3 days later they're playing a top level European Cup competition on a Wednesday night or Thursday night. The same with NBA, for example. You're having back-to-back games where the
Yeah.
turnaround. So this project within that sporting organization was focused around those really dense periods and the recovery strategies and behaviors that can help educate their coaches to then educate their players and other staff as well. So that's one of the projects. And I guess one of the reasons why that's an area for me that I guess I've focused a little bit on is my work has been around like load monitoring and management, recovery. I did a project when I was working with the English Football Association. And again, this wasn't just me, this was a team of us doing this, but I led this project called the Other 22 Hours. And the concept of that was, as it sounds, focusing athlete and coach attention around everything outside of the training pitch. So, outside of those 2 hours, roughly give or take, that you're training, what are your behaviors outside of that that are helping you recover and prepare for the next training session or competition to come?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. It sounds super interesting. So I guess what are maybe some things that you are like tracking specifically to watch, say, load management, and like what are maybe some signs that like recovery is starting to dip a bit in some of these athletes and teams and stuff like that?
Yeah. So for me, when you want to measure recovery, you always have to measure the stress as well. So I always think of it in those two buckets. So from a stress perspective, are there things you can measure? Now, if that's in a team sport, for example, you might have, like we said, GPS or microsensor technology. That could be total distance, high-speed running, accelerations, that type of work. Maybe in a contact sport, NFL, rugby, it could be tackles, carries, etc. If you have people listening to this who are involved in endurance sports, for example, marathon running, that could be weekly mileage. It could be if you're a bodybuilder, powerlifter, it could be tonnage, for example. So some sort of way of measuring stress. And recovery to me is your ability to respond to that stress. So on the flip of that, then you have historically recovery is measured probably more subjectively. Now, there are obviously a ton of objective metrics or variables you can look at, but historically that would have been a lot through questionnaires like things like soreness, mood, sleep quality, energy, motivation to train, for example. And there are other tests that in a team sports setting or a professional or elite sort of performance setting, we might monitor things like jump height, bar velocity, power, those types of elements where we might do a quick test and see, okay, is Jeff within range of what we expect him to be given the load that he has accumulated yesterday? Now, with some of the commercialization of wearable technology now, some of those metrics become easier to access and to monitor passively. So if you think of technology like Whoop or even Apple Watch, all of the smartwatches, it's giving practitioners the ability to monitor these things without having to constantly probe people every day around like,
Yep.
hey, fill out this questionnaire. Now, again, if I refer you back to like my initial approach, those questions are still really valuable. So those subjective, those feel responses are as important as the data, but it's not in isolation, it's both together. And so I think for me, if you're sorry to put a long answer short, in terms of measuring recovery, measure some sort of stress variable. So that could be heart rate, distance, tonnage, etc. And then measure response to that. That might be sleep, resting heart rate variability. It might be soreness, mood, motivation. And when you have those two things together, then you can start to make inferences and decisions around how recovered or ready somebody is based on how they present from a state the previous day or the previous week, for example.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And like you said, it can be challenging to, again, it's good to get that subjective data, but it's also tough to get that from people. So then you can use the wearable technology to get that information. But as we talked about earlier, it's like there's some pros and cons to just getting one. So having a combination, but you can use one to, if you can't get it, and try and make your best educated guess around what you need to do for that specific athlete or whatever it may be.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I think for me as well, the individual range for those is really important. For example, I know that athletes I've worked with in the past they used to always rate the difficulty of a session differently. So I know that one player would always give this particular session an 8 out of 10, but I know another person would always give it a 4 out of 10. But if both of those players gave it a 6, I would know, oh, that's a little bit low for this person, or actually that's a bit high for this person, even though the rating is technically the same. The same goes for all of these variables, like from a stress and a recovery point of view. Okay, how much distance or tonnage do you typically experience on a day or a week or a month or a rolling average? And then how do you typically respond? What's your normal resting heart rate? How many hours of sleep do you normally get? And all of those factors to me within an elite setting, but now I guess everybody is having access to is through these wearable devices of, okay, this is my normal range. And how I like to think about your response to recovery is if you see, you'll have this in my head, it's a sort of a normal, an average line and a sort of a shaded area either side of it. And if all of your data falls within that, then you're probably recovering fine. There's not really much action for you to do. If you see, for example, a big change in some of your metrics, that to me is a bit of a red flag to say, okay, what's going on? Is there something we have to intervene with? Has this athlete not recovered fully? Are they sleeping sufficiently? And then you start to dig back towards or through all of the different variables that you have to try identify the cause of the sort of ill response.
And I guess in these settings too, in a one-on-one setting, I feel like it's a lot easier, right? You know what the person's using, but I would imagine when it becomes like more of a team setting, you may not be able to get the same exact data from everyone because it may be dependent on what they take, or is it pretty uniform? And then at that point, is it again more so like the overall load that from a game standpoint or practice load, right? That then it's more of a team thing that you need to fix, or more of an individual fix there? If that makes sense, what I'm asking, I feel like that was a couple questions lumped in one there, but
Yeah, I think so. Okay, from a source point of view, typically in teams, you'll see like the organization sign a contract with a company, for example. So I say that because one, it helps with ensuring the data is comparable and
yep,
it's reliable and accurate. So if it's a GPS provider, a team will obviously sign and get sufficient units to cover all of their athletes. They'll use the same heart rate straps. The challenge now, actually, and I've shared this previously and I had a conversation with somebody the other day. The challenge now is some athletes have individual commercial relationships with other companies. So let's say, for example, in a football setting, if a team wants to use an Oura ring to monitor and measure sleep and recovery and the other metrics that are available on the ring, but two athletes in their team or organization are Whoop sponsored athletes. I'm just using two devices that are commonly as well known. What happens in that situation? So does the athlete have to forego their commercial responsibility and wear the team one because they have committed to the team? Do they wear both? Can they resist wearing that one? And that's a challenging situation where that's becoming a bit more common. I speak to a lot of athletes and practitioners about trying to resolve and how to navigate some of those problems. But in terms of if, as a practitioner working in a team sport, what you'll find is that in a group of 24 to 30 or 40 athletes, you'll typically see a bulk of the group present quite normally or as you'd expect. For example, if we've done a training session and a gym session yesterday, it's nothing out of the ordinary. It's a typical session for that day of the week. I know that there's a typical response for players presenting today. So maybe there's a small increase in resting heart rate, there's a little bit of muscle soreness, small bit of fatigue, but there's nothing too crazy. We're not traveling as a team. We're not in preseason. We haven't just played a game or a competition. So I'd expect everybody to present in a certain range or a certain way. So I would say in a squad of 30 athletes, there's probably, hopefully 20 at least that fall into that normal or expected bucket. So for the most part, the strategies and the groupings and the systems you put in place will help them prepare for training on a day-to-day basis. What you might find then is there's maybe 5 to 6, maybe up to 10, that becomes more challenging, but maybe 5 to 6 athletes who present in a way that you don't expect. So maybe, for example, okay, this morning, Jeff, you reported a higher than expected muscle soreness. You've reported calf DOMs that are 8 out of 10 in both your calves. And you have to train today. So that you would be somebody that obviously the performance of the medical team might put a little bit more acute focus in terms of treatment and preparation to make sure you can train, or identify if you're really at risk for different tests, then maybe we reduce your training, or even at worst case scenario, we remove you from training today. And that's the kind of conversations that the backroom team will be having on a day-to-day basis. And the challenging thing with it is mostly the time and how quickly you have to make those decisions. And often it's not a knowledge gap, it's other things that present. So if a coach comes and says, okay, Jeff, you have to train today because we've got a final on this Saturday, there's a decision and a pressure that's been applied to you and to us that we have to account irrespective of how you present and your injury history and everything else. So there's always all those multiple factors that you've got to consider, which make it a challenging but a fun puzzle for performance practitioners.
And again, that's where I feel like the experience and the knowledge comes into and again, what we talked about earlier, knowing the specific athlete and what they're dealing with overall. Yeah, because it sounds like, again, when you're with these athletes, they're training hard, they're training regularly. Like you said, these games are intense, and it's like you can't expect to have perfect metrics. So again, it is that cost benefit analysis. Okay, is it worth it to do this? Do we push it today? And like you said, it's hard to sit here on a podcast and be like, this is what we would do in that situation, because it really is just very context dependent on everything that's going on and what's at stake. And right, it's like, hey, is this a championship game or is this just a middle of the season type game or a preseason game? It's probably going to determine what you would do and what you would push for that person that week and whatnot too.
Yeah, definitely. And if you're a high level athlete of any sport, any activity, I don't know if there's a situation where you're ever never like not 100% fresh. You're always going to be a little bit sore, a little bit tired. And I've seen that over, again, male, female, underage, senior, everyone carries a little bit of something throughout the season. In my experience, one of the teams I worked with, we came back from a 3-week off-season break, and we were trying to re-intro players. So we did a 3-day week before the weekend and then re-intro to a full week. So that was our kind of gradual progression. In those 3 days, we did some like very light speed work and we did some gym, we did a little bit of testing. But in the speed work, we had, I think, 4 or 5 players PB. So they ran a personal best, top speed, max velocity on the first week back in preseason. And they were like, how is this possible? How are we so quicker now after having not done proper training for 3 to 4 weeks? And I said, guys, you're just fresh. You've had 3 weeks and these were contact athletes, where you haven't been tackled 20 times in a game, you haven't been battered, you've just given your body time to actually recover fully. So I think that's an example where, yeah, there's always going to be elements of soreness, fatigue. That's what training and competing at the highest level will do to somebody. And that's where I think those recovery strategies and nutrition and sleep, they all become even more important at that level, because you are really trying to get somebody to recover faster than they technically should be.
Like you said there, in that situation, it's like, hey, if you want to perform your best, hey, let's just not do anything for 3 weeks. And it's okay. Yeah, you probably can't do that during the season. And so at that point, it's like, all right, we got to, again, like you said, focus on the other things, nutrition, sleep, and everything like that, which I do feel like with the recovery thing, people do want the magic trick and stuff like that. But I do feel like, obviously, like you said, load management and whatnot, it's just so freaking important from that perspective. I feel like that gets overlooked. But with what you said there, what are some things from a recovery standpoint that you can do to accelerate that recovery process? Because I did see you had a post where it was like, hey, general recovery could take, just an arbitrary example, 72 hours. But if we can do certain things here, we can speed it up to say 48 hours or whatever it may be. And so what are some of those things that you can do to help somebody recover a bit faster?
Yeah, so how I present this to athletes, but also other people, is you can help accelerate recovery with some strategies, but not at the expense of the basics. So what I'll share with you now is with the context that I assume someone is sleeping hopefully at least 7 hours a night, they're eating sufficient calories, they've gotten a few things right in terms of they're hydrating properly, they're cutting out stressors, everything else. So how, in terms of accelerating recovery, like we said, let's use the soccer football example. Football team plays a game on a Saturday and then they've got to play again on a Tuesday or Sunday, Wednesday, for example, Sunday, Thursday. One of the things, one of the first things I would think about is nutrition. And whilst that is a general behavior, timing becomes a bit more important when you're trying to accelerate recovery, and also macronutrient ratio or breakdown as well. So from a nutrition perspective, if someone has just, for example, played a game or had a competition, I'd be flooding carbohydrate into the system to replenish glycogen. So for me, I would be looking at somewhere between 3 to 4 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now, I will let you do the pounds conversion for anybody in the States and North America, but 3 to 4 grams per kilogram of body weight. And I would say within 3 to 4 hours of finishing a competition. And there's some good evidence now to suggest that timing actually does matter, particularly when performance the next day is important. Now, when I say performance, I don't mean someone's going to necessarily go out and play another game. They may do in a sport like NBA or even at Olympics. They might have to repeat and go again. But a lot of other teams who don't have a competition every second day, they also still train the next. And so that's still important to replenish. The other ratio or metric that I would look at would be a 3 to 1 carbohydrate to protein ratio. So for example, if that's 90 grams of carbs, that's 30 grams of protein. If that's 150 grams of carbs, etc., that type of ratio. So both of those things as soon as possible after a competition or intense training session. The other piece is then so that I would say is somewhat generic. It's relative to body weight for the individual. The other strategies in terms of recovery that I'm sure everyone will see: ice baths, hyperbaric chambers, foam rollers, Normatec boots, red light, everything. To me, they're all really valuable tools, but I think people need to be a little bit more specific with when they use them. And this is one of the reasons, like I've shared a shit recovery framework out before, which is basically made to help people make decisions around what strategy to use and when to use it. So, for example, if someone feels, and sorry, the shit recovery framework is the acronym for shit is stiff, heavy, irritable, and tired. And for me, if someone is presenting as stiffness or high levels of stiffness, and someone else is presenting as high levels of fatigue or tiredness, I can't recommend the same strategies to both of those athletes because they're presenting in two very different ways. And for example, for Jeff, for example, you're presenting as really stiff, you're 8 out of 10. There are some active strategies, maybe some contrast therapy, maybe some mobility work, so yoga, stretching, that type of stuff that might help you, or even sitting on a bike, spinning it over, blood flow restriction. Whereas if I'm presenting as really tired, a nap might be the best solution or strategy for me. But in that situation, I'm not sure that a nap is going to help you reduce your stiffness, particularly if you have to train later on this evening or this afternoon. And so the advice I give is not actually, I'm not going to name one specific one. I'm going to say use the shit recovery framework, but basically try target specific recovery for specifically how you present as an athlete. And even as a coach, I've been sent loads of versions of the shit recovery framework adapted to the facilities that a coach has or a team has. Maybe you have a version for when you're traveling versus when you're in your home facility. Maybe there's one for in training versus at home. And people will have access to different equipments. Some of the things I've listed on that to try be inclusive are very expensive, and some top level sports teams don't even have access to in their own facilities. And some will be as simple as nap, breathwork, meditation, journaling, yoga, things that are free. So there's quite a mix. So I would say adjust and accommodate the different strategies that you actually have access to.
Yeah, no, that's a good point you bring up, right? It is very dependent on what you're presenting and what that looks like. Like you said, you're not going to necessarily tell someone that's not tired to nap, whereas the other person that is, maybe that is exactly what they need. But I do like too that you hit on this is assuming people are sleeping enough, right? Because people will, again, tend to overlook that, right? Where it's, hey, not really sleeping enough. What recovery things can I do? So that's the most important thing. Definitely don't overlook the basics. And then it does, like you said there, it really does seem like the carbohydrate timing specifically really does help speed up that recovery process there. So really timing your nutrition around your training or game or whatever it may be for you specifically can be super helpful. What about like how much have you maybe started to look into things like circadian rhythm? Like how big is that going to play for some athletes and just people in terms of recovery as well too?
Circadian rhythm is really interesting, and this is the challenge when it comes to this. This is where there's some differences for health and general population versus elite performance or elite athletes. In the past, we have tried to account for and understand someone's preferences. So whether they're a night owl, morning person, that type of consideration. The few limiters on that are one, imagine I can't change someone's competition time.
Yep.
And so for if my group of soccer, basketball, rugby athletes come to me and they're all morning people, but all of our competitions are at 7, 8, 9 p.m. There's very little that I can do to accommodate for that. Now, in training, potentially we can shift things around to better suit people. In my experience, in team sports anyway, you tend to see a pretty even split of preferences. And so if you have 24 athletes, I would say on average, 8 tend to present as morning people, 8% as evening people, and 8 have no preference. And so how do you navigate that situation? If we use that example in like practical terms, what I would say is we try orient, if the sport, let's say, is football or soccer, try keep the sports session to the middle of the day, or if it's midday, 12 o'clock, for example, because that means you've accounted for both people, because you say, okay, everyone, that should appease everybody from a circadian or like a preference perspective. Now, in terms of then other training around that, whether that's gym based or individual work, potentially then you start to get in conversations around, okay, if people have morning preferences, can we as a performance staff provide a service in the morning for some people and in the afternoon for other people? Now, that always isn't possible with travel and other things, but that's a situation where you can start to hopefully get the most out of people. And that's from an adaptation and a training perspective, less so a competition perspective. With a competition perspective, when you have someone who is a morning type who is competing in the evening, which is a huge proportion of athletes, like we just said, there are some things you can consider. One is just the athlete getting used to doing that. So there's an element of routine in doing that in itself. The other strategy, which I find a lot of athletes prefer and just, or not even prefer, just is an afternoon nap. So the recommendation might be, okay, look, you're playing at 8 p.m. this evening or competing at 8 p.m. this evening, but this person normally wakes up at 6 or 7 a.m. If they want to keep that from a circadian rhythm perspective, or they just wake up naturally, what I would suggest to them is, okay, do your morning routine as normal, prepare for the game, but let's schedule in an afternoon nap if that's possible. And there's plenty of evidence to support an afternoon nap can actually improve cognitive function, alertness, performance levels in the afternoon. So if athletes do, that can be a way that can help them avoid this sort of excess feeling of fatigue as it gets to their preferred nighttime. They're still on the pitch, on the court, on the track, actually competing. So that's one strategy that I think is useful for those for all athletes, but particularly those morning type athletes who prefer to get up early. Give them that opportunity in the afternoon to get a bit more rest before an evening competition.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like you said, at first you got to differentiate between general pop and athletes, right? Because general pop, there's probably a lot of things that we can do to help maximize your circadian rhythm. But then athletes, again, just like we were saying earlier with, hey, if you got a competition coming up, you got to be ready. So same thing here. It's, hey, if you have to compete at night, like it is what it is and you have to do it. So you have to adjust and do what you can there. You can't really change that. But I'm a big hockey guy and I know that the afternoon naps are like super popular with those athletes there, which again, for myself speaking, like I play hockey once a week and we usually play earlier in the day and we've had a few later games. And it's like, dude, I just do not feel as good playing later. And when sometimes I do have to train later at night and like I can tell a difference. So like it definitely, I think would be something that you do, like you said, need to adjust. And it's interesting how the body really does work on that sort of circadian rhythm like that. But generally speaking though, like from a recovery standpoint, again, it is what it is, right? If you have a competition at night, you have to do it. But is that something that you do see can impact recovery and something that you do really need to focus on and try and maximize? Because I guess the other thing that I could see being problematic would not only are competing late at night, and every or later at night, people are probably having caffeine around that time. And then obviously you need a fuel around these competitions as well too, which I could see being problematic. Is that something that you do see impact overall recovery?
Definitely the caffeine. And caffeine it's legal, it's a performance enhancer.
Yep.
It's, to me, with a lot of athletes, is a no-brainer to use in competition. I do caveat that within competition. And if, for example, people are, and this goes for elite athlete and general population, if you're exercising or training during the week, for example, in the evenings, I would not use caffeine if you have a competition. So even in your situation, if you're competing and you prefer to play in the earlier in the day, you've got a couple of late afternoon or evening kickoffs, like competitions, that's a situation where I'm happy for you to consider taking caffeine. And you've just got to make a decision. Okay, is the caffeine, is the performance effect I'm getting from caffeine outweighing the potential impact it has on my sleep? Now, for a lot of elite level athletes, the answer is abundantly clear. It is absolutely yes. It's worth it for one day. Now, a lot of athletes that I've worked with don't consume caffeine. They're quite strict on caffeine intake during the week. So they will use it for training in the morning. They might use a pre-workout that has some caffeine in it for gym. They might have coffee. A lot of the athletes that I've worked with like coffee as a social sort of culture piece as well, but would be pretty strict on stopping it after 2 p.m., for example, during the week. And then for competition, you can dial up the caffeine because you're getting a big performance effect. But certainly is a big consideration because there's some good research that I refer to, and I can't remember the name of the paper or the authors, but we can always include it in notes, whatever. But it examined the effects the caffeine had on sleep. And this is where, again, an interesting insight for the objective data versus subjective. People didn't perceive that there was a negative effect, which a lot of people who can probably relate to that to justify having an afternoon or an after dinner coffee, espresso, whatever it is. But when they measured sleep objectively, caffeine did alter sleep architecture. So it did affect time spent in different sleep stages. And that to me was very highlighting because I know a lot of people who do say, oh, caffeine doesn't affect me. Now, there is a genetic component to how quickly caffeine is broken down as well. So you can do a test to explore that gene. And so for some people, it is legitimate. But generally speaking, if you're having caffeine later in the day, it is going to have an effect, a negative effect on your sleep.
And I'm sure if, again, we come back to the lead athlete here, first, before we go on to that, my men's hockey league, not worth it for me, right? So it's not worth it at that point. I've weighed cost analysis of that. But for these elite athletes, and I think I saw this in one of your posts too about sleep. It's one night of maybe not the greatest sleep. That shouldn't be something that we should overly stress about. So again, it does come down to, is that maybe somewhat suboptimal sleep worth obviously the better performance? And I'm sure it is for a lot of these athletes. And then from there, it just comes down to, all right, let's just try and get things back on track the next couple days there, where obviously I'm assuming it could become problematic is the more games you have in general. But that's probably an issue itself there as well too.
Yeah, 100%. And I think like maybe in a situation where if you're in the NBA and you're playing every night or 3, 4, 5 nights a week, maybe you just accept, and maybe that's a situation where players just they're forced to shift their day clock and their circadian rhythm later, because particularly if they're playing away, those guys aren't getting home or into a hotel room till early hours in the morning. And again, is the caffeine worth this sort of impact on sleep? Potentially it is for those guys, because not just from a season perspective, but a career perspective, money, and there's so much at stake at those things. So I think you do everything you can. There are also other things that you can take to help relax and calm post competition that can help, not necessarily, I don't want to say combat the effects of caffeine, but can sort of help subside. And you'll hear a lot of supplements like magnesium, L-theanine that can help relax people, ashwagandha as well. So there, again, I'm not going to recommend that someone listening to this takes all those things and takes a load of caffeine at 8 p.m. and then takes all of these to try combat it. It's not necessarily how it works, but there are some things you can do. And a lot of elite athletes will try balance those stressors and accelerators with things that help calm them down as well. So if that is routine, if it's breath work, if it's yoga, stretching, every athlete will have their own preferences for those things as well. So that's the thing that I think a lot of people don't see is, all they see is the pre-workout and the caffeine and the competition and the game day, but they don't see a lot of the things that happen after, like we said about refueling. And carbohydrate and protein can help support sleep. Protein can help improve sleep quality. Carbs can help improve or reduce sleep latency. And so They're the things that people see the everything leading up to an event or a competition and then think, okay, I'm switching off the game. I don't care what happens afterwards. But all of these things do happen, particularly at the elite level.
Yeah, and that's probably like you where again, like you said, all the other things are super important, like trying to dial down stressors elsewhere to account for some of that. And then on top of it, I wonder because I feel like I've also seen you make this post too, but like being there's got to be a little bit of a resiliency that you can build up as well too to handle some of these stressors. So it's like a combination of, hey, let's dial down some of these maybe stressors that we don't need that are going to be filling up our bucket. And then also, I'm assuming probably a lot of these athletes also just have that higher bucket that they can just handle this. Or again, there's those people that maybe don't do it as well. And those are probably the one athletes that maybe are injured a bit more and they just get filtered out anyways overall.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and I think one of the examples I can give to maybe come back around to an answer. When I worked in rugby, we always had a couple of athletes come in. If we had athletes away for a summer, they might have come in and trained with us a pre-season. They were coming from a lower tier, who were great players, and were by any accounts super fit in a game. One of the things they challenged with was not necessarily the intensity of a single session or a fixture. It was the accumulation of training load across a week. And I think that's one of the things that people forget, that elite athletes train a lot. And you do develop a robustness to that because it's this paradox, like the fitter you get, the more robust you become. But obviously, as you start to get fitter, you're at risk because you're not used to tolerating that load. So there's this like upward spiral of if you can stay healthy and keep developing aerobic fitness and strength and just capacity to high training loads. We know that has protective effects. I don't want to say protection is a strong word, but it does have effects on helping reduce injury risk. It also it helps it helps reduce injury risk when it comes to things like big changes in load as well. And so we know that from a true sprinting perspective. We also know from a recovery perspective that people who are fitter tend to have less variation in heart rate variability, for example. And that tends to be reflected in their ability to recover faster between sessions. So all of those things are really important. And like you said, I think the training double days or back-to-back double days or three competitions in three matches in 3 nights for an NBA player or two matches at the top level in 5 days for a football player, you have to develop a little bit of robustness to do that. And whilst some amateur athletes might survive in one game of high level competition, maybe it's backing it up day to day and week to week that they would definitely struggle with.
Yeah, it really makes me appreciate these guys that freaking again, like I said, I'm a big hockey guy. They play 82 games a year, and some of these guys freaking are just like they play over 1,000 games. That's freaking insane. It's got to be a combination of good genetics, good resilience, good fitness, but then also again like really dialing in recovery and taking care of your body as well too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, those good like any athlete who's playing just that number of games a season is crazy. And I know in America they're probably a little bit better at, and there's some strict rules on coaches not being able to contact athletes in off-season periods. There's like pros and cons to that, I guess. It gives a good psychological break. I know in the UK and Europe and even in Australia, like we would have provided off-season programs to athletes to maintain their fitness, address any weaknesses they might have had, but also without being too invasive. It was, look, here's the structure we recommend. We know you're going to be away traveling. Try get this done if you can. But it's also a really good opportunity to, like I said, address those weaknesses for a lot of athletes. I think, like, I don't know, I just brought this situation up, but I do think there's a lot that different sports can learn from other sports. And again, like I said at the start, that's one of the things I've enjoyed about working with different athletes and different organizations is that I end up picking up different pieces from different sports and hopefully applying what's relevant in places that I work or people that I work with.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I guess one in terms we've talked about it a few times, resting heart rate. Is that something that you'll commonly use? Because I've heard mixed. Like I personally like to use resting heart rate with my clients because I feel like it's an easy way to get those a good number. Whereas like something like HRV, I know HRV is great, can be a little bit tougher to get a good HRV reading. So I like to use resting heart rate a lot. So I'm just curious, is that something that you do see a lot of use in using? What are maybe some pros and cons of using resting heart rate?
Yeah, resting heart rate is probably the one that I would use universally across everybody and universally in that a range of athlete levels. So from amateur right the way up to elite professional, but also it's a relevant metric from a health or longevity perspective. So in general, what I say for people that have a wearable device is to try use average resting heart rate across the overnight period. That tends to be the most stable measure. And then when you see changes, you know that those changes are meaningful and significant. From a general health or longevity perspective, typically a lower value is better. And that's one of those values that we can actually say with confidence. Heart rate variability and a few other pieces, there are some evidence to suggest a higher heart rate variability might have a lower risk of mortality, but the values are so impacted by genetics and they're so individual. Whereas resting heart rate, yes, your resting heart rate might be different to mine, but in general, lower values are associated with improved health outcomes. So that's quite clear in my understanding of all of the evidence that we provide. And there's some specific data that showed, I believe, a 10 beat per minute reduction in resting heart rate results in a 16% reduction in mortality risk. And so I actually shared a case study of somebody. I had access to their data for a 5-year period. And over that 5-year period, this person reduced their average resting heart rate by 9 or 8 or 10 beats per minute. And it was so clear and linear. Every year they reduced their resting heart rate by 2 beats per minute. And that was through a really simple changes, behavior changes. Simple isn't easy, but it was maintaining good sleep behavior. It was a large reduction in alcohol intake. It was an improved consistency of exercise. So not even necessarily doing more, just being more consistent, a bit more aerobic work, and eating 90%, 80, 90%, still eating out, still traveling, still doing all those other things that everybody wants to do. But those big rocks made this massive change. I thought that was really powerful to see it over a 5-year period, because one of the challenges, say, and I've gone on a tangent from your question, so I'll
No,
come
it's
back to it.
perfect.
Often people will use these devices for 6 months, a year, and then they'll just say, "Oh, okay, no, I'm bored. I'll just scrap it." Or they work really hard at some routines, trying to improve their health performance, and they don't see that big change. For example, this person, they might have given up after a year because they've only seen a 1 or 2 beat per minute drop in resting heart rate. And if me and you were here talking about how important that metric is, after they've worked their ass off for a year, they might go, "Oh, I've only reduced it by 1 beat per minute. That's actually nothing." But this person was persistent and they stuck at it for 5 years. And then when you have that amount of longitudinal data, you can really show someone, go, "Look, this is the true benefit of long-term consistency in terms of, again, simple health behaviors." But the same goes for anything. And I've shared some visuals on this before. People tend to overestimate the acute benefit or impact of something and underestimate the long-term effect. We use the January case. Everyone thinks, "Oh, I'm going to make so much progress in a month." They typically don't, just because you and I know that doesn't tend to happen. And if it does, it's not sustainable. But they underestimate what they can do in a year, 2 years, 5 years. And that's the kind of messaging I would give with wearable technology as well, is zoom out a little bit, look at those longer term trends. That tends to be more insightful than some of the getting too obsessed over a couple of different data points.
Well, yeah, nine, like you said, over almost 9 beats per minute over that. That's pretty significant, right? I'd be curious, did that show up? How that specifically showed up for that person? Did it? I'm assuming it did in some form or fashion. Less injuries, probably better performance overall in everything.
Better performance, improved fitness. Person's a runner, so improved running fitness, improved strength, upper body, lower body metrics like power, strength, body composition, even energy. So again, there's a combination of objective and subjective markers there. So I would say all around, that reflection or that review of 5 years has presented itself, obviously in a reduction in resting heart rate, like we discussed, but also in all of the things you'd expect to go with it. But again, you would, if after 6 months, you maybe wouldn't have seen those changes in strength or power or fitness. But over the 5 years, it's pretty much a linear, either decrease or increase in whichever variable.
It's interesting too, because this is what we said earlier, where it really depends on the person. Like, I feel like in terms of how quickly you can get it to go down, like I've seen it go down for some people, like you said, fairly quickly, but then obviously some people it's a bit longer. But again, I think it depends on, again, what do they struggle with, right? Like you said, I do feel like a lot of people underestimate the impact of good aerobic fitness to really drive that down. But like you said, obviously alcohol, caffeine, watching that, all those things are going to be super helpful there. I guess when we're looking at this, in terms of more day to day, kind of short term, how would it impact your decision making from day to day? And then also, are we looking at, hey, you get someone's baseline and where is that number trending from there? What does that kind of look like from that perspective?
Yeah, from a day-to-day or week-to-week perspective, I actually have some content prepared for this that's coming in the next few days, so relevant to our conversation.
Sweet.
I've got it scheduled. For me, day-to-day, if everything is normal, stick to the plan. Go with what your day has in your calendar, in your schedule, and there's nothing to do. If you see these changes, like big swings. So for example, and I use this because it's an easy round number. If your resting heart rate is 50 beats per minute, and tomorrow morning you wake up and you 60 beats per minute, that there's something clearly going wrong. Assuming your data is correct and accurate,
Right.
there's something going on in your system, particularly when it's unexpected. So that's a surprise to you. Now, if you wake up tomorrow morning, you've had 6 beers, 3 glasses of wine, you've eaten out late, you've gone whatever, you might expect to see that. That to me is just, okay, that's some alcohol and maybe some poor food choices that are showing up in your data. That should subside after a day or two. Sometimes it's going to take a few days, but that's the situation. So you've got to be able to distinguish or differentiate between expected or unexpected. So yeah, if you're at a party, you're drinking alcohol, I'm expecting to see some negative effects on my data tomorrow. That's a situation where I would make an adjustment in both. So if you see that big of a change, I can pretty much guarantee that if you've had the alcohol, you're going to feel pretty trash after that. Adjust your day accordingly. Sometimes you may not have symptoms from an illness with the first situation. So if you see an unexpected increase, sometimes this technology can actually identify changes in physiology that precede symptoms. And I think that's a really interesting use case for this technology. The other situation which I would recommend some change or action on a day-to-day or on a weekly basis is if you start to see, and I think you alluded to it, this sort of declining trend outside of your normal range. So for example, again, 50 beats per minute is your average. Think of that as a horizontal line. If you see tomorrow, if you see 54, that's probably within plus or minus. Maybe you've trained hard today, no problems. That's fine. But if you see 55, 56, 57, 56, 57, and you start to see this trend outside of, or it's elevating your resting heart rate, that's a situation where you could probably do with either reducing training intensity or load, maybe just taking your full rest day, maybe trying to reverse that pattern so you get back into your normal range. So there are the couple of situations where I think I would take action with some of the data. I've tested so many of these devices, and for me personally, I find it much easier to dissociate from the numbers because if you see so much of it, like like I said, I find it personally easy to dissociate. I know other people don't, and they find it very difficult, and they wake up and it's the first thing they see and it can influence. So the other advice I would give to people if they do have these technologies is wake up first and just do a little self-check-in, literally 15 seconds. Okay, how did I sleep? Do I feel good? I would say use the shit recovery framework. Am I stiff? Am I sore legs? How's my mood? Am I tired? If you are a data-driven person, you can log those in a Google form. You can create your own app now pretty easily these days. So you can do that, or you just do it as the self-check-in. Then get up, check your wearable data. If everything matches, hey, bingo, carry on. Do as you have planned for the day. If a situation arises where there's something different, well, then just have a little think about it and go, okay, why is it different? If I feel great, but my resting heart rate's 10 beats per minute higher than my normal, okay, what did I do yesterday to cause that? Nothing. Okay, maybe I should take it easy today so that hopefully I just recover quickly and get back into normal. The other situation I shared recently was sometimes people have this fear, or not fear, but like anxiety that they've slept badly just when they've woken up once. So this happened to me, and it's probably happened to you or anybody hopefully listening, where you might have woken up, if your alarm normally goes off at 7 a.m. and you wake up at 6, you check your phone or check your clock and you go, oh, okay, woke up. You'll wake up at 7 thinking you had a bad sleep because you woke up just before you were supposed to. And sometimes the wearable data can help reassure you that you had a great night's sleep. Everyone thinks of it as the opposite situation. But I've seen this before where someone then can check their wearable data and the whole night up until that point is like the most restful sleep that they've had, no disturbances, just no movement. And then they've had one wake up and that's what they remember. So sometimes the wearable data can actually be used to support the positive aspects as much as the alternative as well.
No, that's a good point because it is all usually like a negative. Oh, it's just going to lead to people overthinking and add more stress. But like you said, it can also be positive. So I think it's good to look at it from that standpoint. Because like you said, when I have clients track this number, like that is one thing when they see it go up, like it is almost like another thing that adds stress to their system because now they're having anxiety. So look, it's not, you need to stress about it. It's just like, hey, this is just a sign that you need to focus a bit more on just more recovery, parasympathetic type stuff versus just, hey, maybe today's not the day you try and set your PR. If you don't have to do that, if you have to compete, then obviously, again, what we've been talking about, you have to do what you have to do. But yeah.
There's some situations as well, which people do forget, or it isn't presented as much online or marketing. But for example, for heart rate variability, some people assume that higher is better, but there's a lot of evidence and data collected in elite level sport that actually athletes might see a drop in heart rate variability on a competition day. And the experts in this field, and that's not me in that this is sort of heart rate variability experts that I learned from, suggest this is due to a level of performance anxiety. And I say this in a positive way, excitement,
Yeah.
energy, that they wake up the morning of competition excited, ready to go. And so potentially you want your system to be in a little bit of fight or flight. You don't want to be overstressed. Potentially on a wearable device, that might show up as yellow or bad recovery, 50 or red or whatever the negative connotations are. Whereas actually it's not a negative. That's actually the perfect situation for an athlete to go, yeah, okay, I'm recovered. My resting heart rate maybe is stable or low. My heart rate variability might drop because I'm anxious to get on the field today or on the court. And then that's where you also layer in the feelings. Okay, do I feel ready? And then the best athletes know that, and they're confident going into game day that, okay, if I wake up and I see some of that, I know I've done all the preparation leading into this point. So I know when it comes to kickoff or start line or whatever the competition is that I'm ready, even though maybe one or two variables are off. You've just got to make sure that 99 variables are on point and maybe one or two might be a little bit off, and that's fine.
Yeah, no, that's a great point you bring up. Again, if your resting heart rate's super low and your HRV super high leading into important competition, you definitely have to wonder, why are you not anxious at all for that? So yeah, that makes sense. It's almost a positive, and you could overthink that from that perspective. So I guess last topic that I want to discuss, and we've hinted at it a little bit, but and I think a lot of people don't necessarily or they don't realize how much this can impact it, but alcohol on things like your resting heart rate and your HRV. And I think you did it yourself, where you looked at some data on yourself over a year time span and noticed like definitely changes in your resting heart rate and HRV when consuming it.
Yeah, so I did this last year, and I've done it a few times, but I did it the whole year last year. I logged every single unit of alcohol that I drank. Now, last year was a bit of an anomaly for me because I had a huge number of weddings, which for me just tended to be a place that I drank a bit more. That is not my typical drinking pattern in any way. Usually I'd still have a few drinks. I like wine. I prefer that over other types of alcohol. But I did this every day last year. And the pattern is probably as people would expect. As I drank more alcohol, again, I can share this post or the visuals with the listeners. As I bucketed the charts I presented into four. So it would be no alcohol, small amounts of alcohol, so maybe up to 2 glasses of wine, so maybe up to 5 units, 5 to 10 units, which was moderate, and then anything over that to me is a lot of alcohol. And luckily, I didn't have too many that were obviously excessive amount, but you see this pretty linear pattern. So for every increase in alcohol unit, you tend to see this pretty big increase in resting heart rate or a decrease in heart rate variability. For me as well, you often, or my data presented, you see a reduction in sleep quality. So more restful or more restlessness and more awake time as well. Now, for some other people, that may present a little bit differently, but typically that's pretty much as you'd expect. One of the things, there's a few little slight caveats. Sometimes you can try, look, there's no advice to drink alcohol. That's probably one thing I need to note, and that it's pretty much going to be bad for you no matter how much you drink. There's a few things you can do to help mitigate the acute effects on that night of sleep. One is the earlier you drink, the better. And obviously, the less you drink, the better, of course. But if you have a glass of wine or two at a late lunch or an early dinner and stop drinking, if you give as much time as you can before going to bed and stop drinking, that will definitely help. And I think the wearable data can actually be used for individuals to monitor the dose that affects them. For example, I found with beer, if I drink a couple of beers, the same equivalent as wine, I find that has a bigger impact on my system than if I have the same equivalent alcohol in wine. And so I think people might have different responses to different alcohols. I also think potentially for some people, and for me, like one drink doesn't actually have a negative effect on my resting heart rate or heart rate variability. Okay, if I do want to go out for a dinner with friends, I'll have a glass or two of wine, maybe. Try to do it earlier. I'll stop drinking alcohol later into the evening. And they're the things that can help mitigate the acute effects. And you brought it up earlier on. I think, again, like one night of bad sleep or poor physiology in the grand scheme of things is not bad. Obviously, if that becomes a consistent pattern or there's consecutive days of drinking alcohol and poor sleep, poor physiology, that's not what we want to see. But if someone is a little bit anxious and still wants to drink alcohol, like I said, I'm not advising people do it, but if they do drink alcohol and they want, I would get them to consider those two things. Try drink a little bit less, a little bit slower, try drink a bit earlier in the day or the evening, but also then monitor the trends on their wearable data. This is what it's actually useful for. Maybe one day drink beer, see if it's different to wine, and then find what has the least impact on you that you can have the most enjoyment out of. And that's the balancing act of using some of the data for health and for fun and enjoyment as well.
And like, how does, like you said, one night, because people they'll over obsess over one night, but then it's okay, that's fine if you want to go enjoy, definitely. Because I think when it comes to life, like you want to have those things. And if it gives you that sort of social connectedness, like that's probably going to have net positive. So it's look into all those things. But how does that night of drinking then impact your decision making over the next couple of days? Because when you wake up, your resting heart rate's higher. I feel like now you're in a more stressed state. So how does that impact your decision making? So it's just like, how do all those things add up? And what's that trickle down effect from the next couple of days? Because I feel like for my clients, when I see them, it ends up being, okay, now that next day, they don't want to move. They make worse food choices. And then that bleeds into now they're not getting good sleep the next night. And like you said, it's that kind of trickle effect there that can be impactful. So it's always like connecting the dots of, okay, this is what happened. Here's how your body responds to that. What are the things that we need to do to make sure you can bounce back quicker, essentially?
Definitely. It's the exact same thing we talked about with the elite athlete and caffeine. And you can do things to counter or post-game nutrition. You can do things to help recover faster. It's the same with if you do go out and socialize and drink some alcohol. Make some good other decisions that support it. So if the alcohol is something negative for your system, of course it is. We know that, we accept it. Make everything else positive. So eat well, hydrate properly, make sure your environment is cool. I tend to get quite warm if I have a few alcohol units. So I make sure the bedroom's cool. There are definitely things. And also the next day, prepare food. This is something that a nutritionist I worked with used to always say. He was like, if you are going on a night out to have a few drinks with mates or after a competition to celebrate, make some food, or for dinner, make extra so that when you come home and you're hungry, instead of rooting around for like chips, deep fried food, frozen, whatever it is, just have something, have a sandwich ready that's going to help. So it is all those things. And also just plan it the next day. So maybe you do it on a day where the next day is a low intensity workout or a recovery day or whatever it might be, so that alcohol decision isn't having a negative impact on, you're meant to be PBing today or you're meant to be competing today. I hope no one's doing that the day before a competition.
You never know, though. You never know. Some people are freaking crazy like that. Yeah, man. No, it's crazy because it makes me think back to my college days. And I'm like, how the hell did I even? It was like you wouldn't go out till 10 or 11 p.m. and then you'd freaking drink till 3 or 4 in the morning. I'm just like, man, that is crazy. And I think it definitely goes to show how resilient your body can be when you're younger and bounce back. But once you get older than that, it's, man, that just.
Age is definitely a contributing factor, 100%.
Yeah. Yep. As much as I don't want to blame age on things, there's definitely some things from that perspective that it does impact. Cool, man. Really appreciate your time. Super interesting. Like I said, I knew that I feel like we got through a lot of the stuff I wanted to discuss too. And yeah, man, a ton of great information here. So really appreciate it. So I guess where can the audience, one, do you have anything coming out that you want to let the audience know about? And then where can they find out more about you?
No, nothing. Like I always have things ongoing and I do some projects. The best place to find me and connect is probably on Instagram at the moment. So I'm at Dr. Peter Tierney. I have started posting a bit more on on TikTok and YouTube. So I use those if they're your preferred platform, but Instagram or LinkedIn are probably the best places. And if you have any questions, I guess always DM me. I do get back to everybody. Sometimes it takes me a bit of time if I lose a message, but I'll always get back. And I do some one-to-one coaching if somebody does want to do that. I don't take on a ton of clients because I do other project work. But if that is of interest to somebody, they're more than willing, or I'm more than happy for them to drop me a message. We can chat about that as well. But for the most part, I'd love to just connect on Instagram and hopefully get some good challenges and critique there as well.
Yep. I actually found you on X, actually. So I know that you post there as well, too. So definitely go and check you out there. Not as many people use X anymore, but I think there's some great information on there. Cool, man. Really appreciate your time. And yeah, man, we'll have to get you back on the podcast again at some point. And so thank you a ton for your time, Peter. And we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. Thanks for having the conversation with me.